Would you pray with me? Divine One, as we hear of this perhaps new story to many of us, help us to find the message that it has for us today, in addition to understanding the history behind it. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of each of our hearts be filled with your wisdom and your insight. Amen. So the book of Genesis, right, that we spent a number of weeks on. Genesis took us from creation through the building up of the tribe of Israel with the story of Abraham. After Abraham, we get the stories of the patriarchs, Isaac and Jacob and Joseph. So that by the end of the book of Genesis, we find that this loosely hung together tribe of Israel is now sojourning through the land of Egypt. They're journeyers, travelers in the land of Egypt. By the time we get to Exodus, the second book in the Bible, these travelers have become slaves in Egypt. And who helps Yahweh to free the slaves from Egypt? Moses. That was your easy question of the day. So, Exodus gives us the story of Moses saving the slaves, the Israelite slaves in Egypt. The next three books, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, all talk about the slaves as they're wandering, and they're, like 100,000 of them. We're not talking 20, right? Wandering through the wilderness to try to get to the promised land of Canaan. And those books talk to us a lot about laws and about the organization of the tribe. They're trying to figure out how to coalesce together into a viable unit, right? Which takes some organization and some rules laid down. So that's sort of what all of those books are about. When we come to the end of that story of them wandering in the wilderness, they've got the promised land in their sight, and what happens to Moses? This is your second easy question. Moses dies. Okay? He gets to see the promised land, but he doesn't get there. Who takes over?
Aaron.
Joshua, says the woman who just got her theology degree from Marquette. So if you don't know the answer, look to Maryland. So Joshua takes over the tribe. And it's Joshua's job to lead a military invasion of the land of Canaan. And it is nothing less than that. Let's not kid ourselves, right? So military invasion into Canaan. It leads us in the book of Joshua to believe that everything went really well and they took over all the lands and they were successful thanks to Yahweh. The book of Judges leads us to believe that this was maybe just a little bit less than truthful. Because when we come to the book of Judges, at this time in the history of the Israelite tribes, we now have the 12 tribes of Israel that we've heard about, right? 12 individual tribes, kind of connected as a confederation of tribes, but they still fight one another for power and for land and everything else. So we have this infighting going on. And we discover that they're still fighting the indigenous people of Canaan for power and for land. So the book of Judges is called the book of Judges because this is the time in Israelites' history where the tribes were led by judges, not like the judges of today. Maybe they heard some disagreements, maybe they settled some conflicts, but they were essentially the ruler of their tribe, and perhaps even the warlord, if you will, of that tribe. This whole time period lasted for about 200 years in Israel's development, from about 1250 to about 1050 BCE, before the Common Era. In the book of Judges, it names, and this was your bonus question, it names 12 judges, that it gives us their stories about those 12 judges. There were 6 minor judges, so we just get little stories about them. And then there were 6 major judges that we have longer stories about. Now, if you like war stories, and you like gore, and you like all those movies where all of these horrible things happen, read the book of Judges sometime. Because it is chock full of just gruesome, awful stories that are not fit for worship. Even the one today was not great, right? And in fact, the one next week is not going to be great either. A lot of death and a lot of war, but this was what was going on in their time period. And the reason that we're hearing 2 of the Judges' stories, so we're going to talk about Deborah today and about Samson. Y'all remember Samson and Delilah, right? Maybe you haven't read the story, but you know at least a little bit about what it's about because it's in our songs, it's in our secular literature. So it's important to flesh that one out next week. I thought it would be important to talk about Deborah because so many people haven't heard of Deborah, and yet she was one of the few female leaders in Israel. And so let's lift her up and talk about her story and recognize that there were some strong, brave women back then. Jael, too, falls into the category of strong women. Sadly, after this story, we never, ever hear about Deborah or Jael again. We hear about Barak and Sisera, but the women get kind of swept under the rug of Israelites' history. Again, we're going to lift them up. So, let's talk about Deborah and the song that makes us think. In the skit, you got kind of a really brief, light version of Judges 5 and this story. Let me just flesh it out a little bit. So, our Inclusive Bible says that Deborah was a prophetess and a governor of Israel. 2 really big titles for this woman. So she was well respected. She was a powerful leader in and of herself. She had a deep connection to God. So when God comes and says, all right, it's time to free your people from what is essentially slavery in Canaanite, she calls for her commander, Barak. Now, let me just say, this is where we realize that Canaan wasn't completely taken over when they reached the Promised Land, because they've fallen away from Yahweh, and they've started worshiping indigenous gods. It happened all the time. You hang out with people from another land, they've got all their little idols and their temples, and you think, well, yeah, my God's good, but maybe I should hedge my bets. And we'll pray to these other ones too. I'll take one of those idols and just put that here on the shelf in my kitchen, and let's say a prayer there. We'll be good. An insurance policy, right? So, over and over again in the book of Judges, the saying says that the people of Israel drifted away from Yahweh, which essentially meant that they were turning to different gods again and again. And because everything happened for a reason back then, God would let them fall into the hands of the enemy because they had drifted away. In this case, Canaan was powerful. They were strong. Not only did they have Sisera, the general, but they were organized. They were like a city-state with all kinds of armaments and 900, scripture says, iron chariots. So, Deborah calls for Barak and says, God said it's time. It's time to raise up an army. It's time to fight the Canaanites. It's time to get our freedom. And he says, okay, I'll go if you go. And she's like, all right, fine. And so she goes along. But the story says that the people that they're raising up are just ordinary civilians. They're like you and me. We don't have, well, most of us probably don't have spears and guns and knives and things in our closets that we can pull out, or the training to go fight 900 ironclad chariots. And yet the people gather. And they fight their darndest. And of course it's with the help of Yahweh that they succeed, because over and over these stories are about the underdog and God who comes to save the underdog. So they win, they are winning, and the evil Sisera, who kind of turns tail and runs, jumps out of his chariot, heads to the tent dwellers, because he's heard that this tribe of tent dwellers has an agreement with the ruler of Canaan, so he thinks he's safe. But there is a deep-seated connection to Moses among these tent dwellers, and I think Jael was smart enough to know that the Canaanites had been running roughshod over the Israelites. So Jael says, come on in, I'll keep you safe. Gives him some nice warm milk, which has sleeping properties, right? Waits until he falls asleep and then takes a tent stake and drives it through his temple, nailing him to the ground. That's the little part we left out. Interestingly enough, the story that you and I read responsibly, the song, says that Sisera falls dead at her feet. So we have conflicting stories among these two, maybe different traditions. Again, hopefully I don't need to say that these are not to be taken as factual history. Right? The battle may have taken place, but some of these other stories around it have been legend that have grown up, and myths that have been altered. So that's the story. And then we have this song that follows right after, that sort of recaps everything. This song, scholars say, is one of the oldest stories in the Old Testament, dating to about 1100 BCE, probably right after the battle was fought. It's a victory song, right? And this song, Walter Brueggemann says, there are three important things to know about it. First, it's a feminist manifesto, because it lifts up again these two strong women who fought, not only helped fight an army and lead an army, but the story of Jael, who we'll come back to in just a minute, who fights someone who's much stronger than she is, uses what she has to help her people. The second is that it's militantly theological. So Moses and Yahweh saved people from slavery in Egypt. And we have that same theme coming back again, where we have Yahweh and now Deborah and Barak and Jael helping to save the people from an oppression, if not outright slavery, by the Canaanites. And once again, Yahweh's coming to the aid of the underdog because they cried out. Because the song says that the roads were unsafe, the travel routes were unsafe, there were robbers everywhere, and village life was next to impossible because it was so dangerous, and the people just wanted to live their lives, right? So they cried out, Yahweh comes to help. The third piece that's so important is that it shows us the social, political context and character of the Israelites. They were not the wealthiest group of people in the world. They were not the strongest, most powerful group of people in the world. They were peasants, they were farmers, they were shepherds and goat herds and whatever else herds they had. They didn't have the spears and the fighting implements. And so when they gathered as an army, they took what they had and they gathered as civilians to fight the strong Canaanites. Right? That sort of systemic conflict between the wealthy and the powerful and the oppressed and the poor and the ordinary civilians and the peasants has been going on over and over and over again throughout history. And we still see it. Teresa, you're talking about the kids in Gaza is a classic example. Right? We talk about the war in Ukraine, which we don't hear a whole lot about anymore, but we have the Ukrainians who are just mostly ordinary people. They're facing this huge fighting war machine that is Russia. And I did my homework and I said, well, what's going on these days? And last Sunday, an article was posted that said that July had the most civilian deaths in Ukraine since April of 2022. 377 civilians were killed and over 2,000 were injured. They continue to fight a country that is much bigger, much wealthier, much more capable, which is why they needed everybody else's help. So we see this struggle over and over again. And it's played out in miniature in the conflict between Jael and Sisera. It's this mini anecdote about the powerful, strong guy that you see walking in, who's probably, picture this guy. He's got to have his, whatever armor they had back then, and he's got I'm picturing him like, big guy, muscles, powerful, I'm in charge kind of guy, hide me now or else kind of thing. And Jael's just a peasant woman living in a tent who doesn't have a whole lot. And he's got his swords and his knives tucked into his boots or whatever he's got, and she's got a tent stake and a mallet. And so again, we've got this classic setup of the powerful and the weak, and the underdog wins because this is where God's strength lies, with the powerless and the helpless and the hapless, to help them use what they have, to give them strength and bravery to win. Now, this is not to say I'm advocating for war, because I want us to look once more at Deborah's song. Well, a victory song this is, right? Because Israel's all about, hey, we just beat this big city-state Canaan, we won, and we just, we didn't have a whole lot. And they had a right to be excited about that. And we could see Ukraine being the same way, couldn't we? Someday along the line, saying, this is our victory song. Because they probably have their Deborahs and their Baraks and their Jaels who are fighting and offering up their lives and using what they have for their people. And so we have this great victory song, but Deborah doesn't leave us there. Who noticed what happened at the end of the song that we read responsibly? What happens, Jen? Where does she take us?
Wishing for, the death of other enemies of God.
Wishing for the end. Okay, go up a paragraph or two.
Okay.
What happens? Who suddenly enters the story?
Sisera's mother.
Sisera's mother. Here we have this great victory song, And now we're in the parlor of the enemy's mother. We just heard Sisera get killed, destroyed, shamed, and now we're with his mom. And what's his mom asking?
Where is he? Where is he?
Where is he? Why isn't he home yet? Why aren't his chariots home? And her attendant tries to placate her, right? Oh, I'm sure it's nothing. I'm sure they won, and they're just having a great time, and they're, those boys and the women and the plunder, I'm sure he's going to bring you back something pretty. Some little something that's embroidered, 2 little somethings that are embroidered. And we see mom going, it says, she repeats it to herself, what her attendant says. Yeah, that must be it. That must be why he's not here. He's going to bring me something. And yet we sense that she already knows that her son's dead. What an ironic twist to the end of a victory song. To take us to the enemy's mother, to remind us that there are always 2 sides to a story. The prophetess and great mother of Israel, Deborah, says we cannot lose our humanity in the midst of our winning. We cannot forget that war has a cost not only to us, while we grieve our fallen, the other side's also grieving the loss of their children. And we cannot forget that. And I think that's the great lesson in Deborah's story. Our politicians and our media don't want to take us behind the scenes of the enemy because we don't want to grow soft about whatever war we're in. And so perhaps it's the role of the church to remind us that there's a cost on every side. Maybe it's why Jesus said, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. To try and make us stretch ourselves to be empathetic toward all people. And so it's our job as spiritual folk to continue to remember, to continue to hold on to our humanity, our capability for empathy, to look at both sides of the story and remember that there are parents whose children die on both sides of every war. And life should be really much more precious than oil or power, or whatever it is we think we're fighting for today. So I lift up Deborah today. Because she was brave and she was strong and she did help lead her people out of oppression, but also because she doesn't let us gloat about it. Because she brings us back and makes us think about what it means to be human, what it means to have empathy, what it means to care for one another, and she asks us to ponder when we're going to figure this all out, and when is it all going to stop.